Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm going to present just some of the points from the country report for Ireland, which I authored. So I've divided the presentation into two parts because we launched the framework in 2003 under the 1999 Act, and then in 2012 there was a second Act which completely changed the paradigm of the qualifications framework and how non-formal qualifications and others were included in it. So I think for those of you who are starting out developing qualifications frameworks, there might be lessons in it for how long it is reasonable to wait in terms of sustainable development before you make changes, major changes to a law or to a system. So I'm not 100% sure what the impact of the changes will be. We're in the middle of our second impact evaluation exercise at the moment. There was an impact evaluation study before the 2012 Act. So we're waiting now in the process of evaluating the impact of the 2012 Act, and if people are more satisfied with the new version or the older version. So I'm going to just say very, very short version of the origin and development of the framework. Factors which and forces which shaped the Irish qualifications framework, how qualifications were placed in the framework originally, and how well or otherwise the system worked up to the passing of the 2012 Act. This is a diagram that's in the country report, but I'm only going to draw your attention to the sections that have shadows on them. And just in summary, in a line from 1958 to 2003, like many other countries, we had stages of economic growth and a number of recessions. Especially in the 80s, beginning of the 90s, we had a significant recession. And during that time, I suppose we had very little movement in the modernization of education. But after that, things picked up. And from, say, 1992 onwards, there was a significant increase, a speed of development of making more sense of all the qualifications in the country. There were, as you would have in other countries, policy papers, green papers, white papers, and so on. The government of the day also established a group called Chastis, which is the Irish word for teach, and its remit was to look at the possible design of a national qualifications framework, to consult widely and look at what was going on around the world and come up with a possible model. So they did that, and the law on the first qualifications framework, if you like, was passed in 1999. But I've also shaded two other boxes down here, and I want to highlight this one, the Universities Act 1997. And this might be familiar to you from critiques of frameworks, that in any development, in any country, policy development, there's always power struggles and tensions. And it has been a criticism of our framework from the start that there was far too much influence of the university sector in how the framework was designed and what was in it and where they were. And that debate has never really, I suppose, got the full public scrutiny that it should have got. So from my point of view, I was working in a university for all those years, but in the adult education sector. So I saw the lobbying that went on from the power brokers of the universities and also from the adult education sector and lifelong learning sector, who had a sort of a social justice civic remit. So it's interesting that during the time of Chastis, the agenda of lifelong learning and adult education and liberal adult education was very much to the forefront. And then for some reason, suddenly, the Universities Act and the Education Act shifted the balance of power towards higher education. But in any case, we were left with that, and the NQF was launched in 2003 with a 5-year run-in phase. So I've just said about Chastis, so I won't repeat, except that they were also to identify progression pathways to make sense of all the qualifications in the country and then to identify pathways. 2 other bodies were established under the Act, HETAC, the Higher Education and Training Awards Council, to regulate non-university or non-DIT, if you like, qualifications from level 6 to 10, and FETAC. And I was saying to colleagues yesterday, we don't use the word VET or TVET for no good reason. We don't say vocational education or technical and vocational. For some good reason, it was decided to call qualifications up to level 6 on the framework further education, and everything above that higher. So that's what we have. So the NQAI became active in 2003. So that's just the visuals, the logos of the new awarding bodies, HETAC and FETAC. And in the middle is the logo of the Department of Education and Skills, because they weren't included in the framework. They regulate schools and still do. The school system never actually became integrated into the national framework. And then there are some logos from the higher education autonomous sector beneath that. So one of the first tasks was to place all existing qualifications in the state onto this new system. So this is an interesting diagram because on the black circles in this rainbow are the new titles of major awards and their levels. The coloured sections in here represent who was responsible for them. So purple are the universities, orange is the DIT and the universities, and that's because there was a separate act for the DIT. The Higher Education and Training Awards Council regulated all the qualifications outside of the universities and the DIT. This is the school sector, the blue, and then here FETAC, the Further Education and Training Awards Council, up to level 6. And you can see that there's overlap at 6 between further education, HETAC and the DIT, but the universities are excluded from that. And they were not too happy at being excluded because they had considerable provision of qualifications at level 6, but under the Act they were now to confine themselves from 7 to 10. But you can also see on the outside of the rainbow where they placed existing awards, and there's a huge bunching of awards at level 6, which is 5 on the EQF. And this again is partly because there were so many at that level, but also because of this power struggle with the universities, in that anything that wasn't deemed of university level was bunched at 6, whether it was justified or not. So this was one of the outcomes that we had from the work of Justice and the outcomes of the Act. I noticed in the Croatia presentation that you have more or less the same language as we have. We have major awards, which are on the black lines in the diagram, and then we have 3 other types: minor awards, special purpose, and supplemental. And we never use the word partial, because linguistically partial means part of as something, whereas a special purpose award can be discrete in itself. So partial wouldn't work for us at all. And I've explained this system to many countries where I was invited to present this, and in a way they found it puzzling, and in a way they found it very useful. And I'm interested that Croatia picked up this exact same conceptual and linguistic division of award types. And in terms of a lifelong learning framework, it's probably one of the most useful changes that was made. So just to say that the Irish framework predated the Dublin descriptors and the European framework. So we had our own descriptors and levels. And generally, we don't look too much into the EQF. But we did have the exercise of alignment, which was done internally in the NQAI. And it's the usual thing that you've seen from the other presentations. 5 equals 6 and 4 equals 5 and so on. There's nothing very strange there. And that's just a different representation of the same thing. But it also shows short cycle that short cycle and the EQF at 5 and 6 in Ireland are overlapping. We have 2 certificates at that stage, though that really refers short cycle to the lower end of the Bologna scale and not to VET. So in a way, that diagram is slightly misleading and maybe suggests something that doesn't quite exist, but in no matter. And I think the Croatia presentation also mentioned that quality assurance for the higher level involves the European higher education area, the quality assurance guidelines for that. So in part 2, what I'd like to do very quickly is to move on to the 2012 Act. And you can probably remember that in those years we had a very serious economic recession, as many countries had. And there was a ministerial decision to cut back the number of national agencies and to amalgamate them. So a lot of education agencies were amalgamated for economic reasons. Whether it is good development to do such a thing is another question. But in any case, we were left with the 2012 Act. I will say something now then about how non-formal qualifications are considered under that Act, the procedures for inclusion, the fees for inclusion, and something about amendments to that Act which are ongoing. So that's just the title of the Act, and we have this new logo which is now from a new body called Quality and Qualifications Ireland. So the old body is gone, and we now have an integrated body, Qualifications and Quality. So this new body became both an awarding body and a quality assurance agency, which is a very strange amalgamation. Usually those powers are separated, but under the 12 Act, we amalgamated those powers. So the functions of this new body, Quality and Qualifications and Quality Ireland, start with quality assurance. And every provider must have quality assurance. Thereafter, they may submit their qualifications for approval and get the QQI award. That's outside the universities and the schools. So they're the 2 important things, the biggest changes. That the first step in inclusion in the framework was approval of quality assurance procedures. So this is just a little bit more detail, that this new body is responsible for the quality assurance procedures of all providers outside the higher education and schools, and that all providers outside must apply to QQI for permission to deliver programs that are included in the framework. So this is the new 2012 rainbow, and you'll see the universities are still purple. The DIT line has disappeared, I was told, because they hadn't enough space to put in the extra colour, not for any good legal reason. So it's all called the Universities of Technology area, but there is a new bill going through now called the Universities of Technology Act, which will change both the status of the institutes and impact on universities, but that's another long story. So this is more or less the same diagram as before. What they also have in it now is who is entitled to give major, minor, special purpose and supplemental awards. So from levels 4 to 10, any provider in there can provide major awards, minor, supplemental and special purpose. So, and QQI, you can see that this is QQI here, the blue in the wheel, and you can see that they range from 1 to 10. So it looks from the diagram as though they're responsible for the awards in the entire framework, but technically they are only taking over from HETAC and FETAC. That's basically what they're doing. In terms of how we define the non-formal sector, we don't actually use the term at all, but QQI has a list of providers which are outside the universities and the schools, and they are all lumped in together into this list, which includes community and voluntary sector organisations, employers, hospital centres for nurse education, private colleges, even higher education colleges, private providers, which are companies, private providers who are individual trainers, public service agencies other than fisheries, tourism and agriculture, which are regulated by the state, sectoral representative bodies, skill nets, training for people with disabilities and youth services. So that is what together forms the non-formal sector in Ireland. We have no sector skills councils, we have no credit rating bodies, we don't have the variety and complexity that a lot of your presentations had. This is the new regime now. Under the new QQI paradigm, if you want your qualifications included in the framework, you must engage in this life cycle of provider engagement with QQI. So the first thing you must do is become a QQI provider. This is for the non-formal list. You must have your quality assurance approved. You must pay the fee to have the quality assurance approved. And when you have all that done, you are then permitted to submit programs or qualifications for approval in the framework, which is completely different to the process as was before. And then it goes on to more fees. There are fees you can see in every box, fees, fees, and fees. So part of this new model is going from, like in France, where they talked about it being a public good and a civic good and a social justice. This is now described as a business model where user pays. So if you want to be a provider, you pay. If you want to have a program validated, you pay. If you want to get a QQI logo on your certificate, you pay. So this has gone from a lifelong learning, inclusive framework to a business model. Now, this is me saying it, but when you look at this, when you see fees, 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 you can't really contradict me. So this is the life cycle, and it is very, very complicated, in my view, because I'm trying to work through it with a number of providers. So now there are all sorts of quality assurance guidelines, statutory, core, and sector specific. So if you are an existing provider with QQI, you go through some of this. If you are a new provider, you go through a whole other set of quality assurance procedures. So it is quite a complex procedure now, especially the top line if you want to become a provider included in the framework. You must go through all this quality approval before you are permitted to offer a training program. And then these are the core. There are all these books online for all providers, and these are for the non-formal sector, if you like, for independent private providers coming to QQI on a voluntary basis. So that's how the non-formal sector is described, as independent private providers coming to QQI on a voluntary basis. In a nutshell, that's the definition. There is something new as well in terms of who owns qualifications. And in the previous NQAI phase, ownership more or less stayed with the body or provider that developed them. But in recent years, QQI has decided that there have been far too many similar programs being developed and difficult to quality assure. So they now have this thing called the Common Award Systems, mostly from levels 3 to 5. And what QQI has done in consultation is develop a series of Common Award standards. And they are published. And if you want to, say, I have on the bottom, you want to train or develop a new program in health and safety or early childhood education, you can't make one up. You have to go into the Common Awards system and use the standards that are in there, which are the minimum expected learning outcomes, and use those as the basis for your new award. You can make changes to it and add to it and whatever, but you cannot invent new standards at the moment in that non-formal sector. And there are around 1,600 active award specifications in this Common Awards system at the moment. A number of you gave statistics, so I took these from the website last week. there are nearly 2,000 QQI awards from levels 1 to 6. Nearly 6,000 programs leading to awards, and you can see from the levels here that there's huge bunching of awards at levels 5 and 6. And these are the disputed areas between further and higher education. Much, much fewer at higher level and fewer at the very lower levels. So there's big bunching in here. So that's where the demand for non-formal qualifications is, at levels 5 and 6 on our framework. There are 573 providers, and as well as that, under NARIC Ireland, there are 979 international or foreign qualifications recognised in Ireland and given a statement of equivalence to a level in the framework. So they were the major changes. On to the thing about money. So what I'm going to show you now are just the levels of fees for dealing with QQI to get your qualifications included. Not the costs incurred in the administration and the employment of quality assurance officers, all the other costs. So if you want to be a new provider, if you're in higher education, you pay £10,000 up front. If you're in further education, it's 5,000 euros. Sorry, I'm going back to a previous existence. And then there are validation fees depending on your sector. So it's quite a lot of money for a voluntary, not-for-profit group to be able to engage with this system. Again, this is for validation of a new qualification. There are fees for that, which are something like 1,500 minimum for a new qualification, which is a lot of money, especially if it's only a small qualification. And then to get the QQI stamp on your certificate, there are a range of costs over there for the different levels. So every one of your graduates will pay a particular fee to be awarded the QQI logo. So in following all of that and all the changes, it was decided that the 2012 Act was not sufficient for all sorts of reasons. So there are pages, about 50 pages of amendments before the government at the moment. But one of the big, I sort of was looking at what their big question is about inclusion, that they don't have sufficient power within the law to be the operational mechanism for the inclusion of all non-formal learning outside of their own quality assured courses. So they are working very hard on finding a way that they can extend the functions of qualifications and Quality Ireland to open it up to a wider range of qualifications and not just those which go through their procedures. So they are working on that, and this would give them more comprehensive powers, but it would also give the non-formal sector more access to the framework itself. So those of you who are interested in reading the country report, in the back are the results of a small survey that we conducted for the country report with the help of QQI with existing providers, and why the changes to the paradigm or the model were uncomfortable or unsuitable for them. And if you want to see what they were saying in that survey, you'll find it in the final chapter of the country report. So I think that comes to the end, and thank you very much for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. One question for Anne from anyone? Okay, you have a French question.
As you like. Well, I just would like to go back to one point that you have quite skipped in your presentation. So the role of industry and sector councils in the Irish construction. So I understood that for you, it doesn't make part of the non-formal realm of qualification. But I would like to ask, in which way it's organized in Ireland, the participation of economic sectors and stakeholders in the construction of the qualification?
In the list, if I can see it, but we'll go back here, of the definitions, thank you. I had one, I did skip over it, and I think we discussed it before at partner meetings, is the third one from the bottom, and the fourth from the bottom, sectoral representative bodies and skill nets. Skill nets are networks of work-based sectors, and it's totally for the provision of integrated and appropriate training within that sector, and they are supported by government money. They are called sector skill nets. I think it's a very unique model to Ireland, but there are representative bodies from agriculture, from transport, from all sorts of work-based and economic sectors, which would have training that they deliver for their own sectors, and they would negotiate then either, and it's something else I didn't put on the slide, if they don't want to become a provider of education and training, they can link with a university or a regional technical college so that that college becomes the deliverer of it, and this is very, very common, they become the partner in the design and development of it. So it makes a whole lot better sense for a sector to go to a university or an institute of technology and develop short, minor, supplemental, major, postgraduate, whatever their need is. Like pharmaceuticals is one of the biggest industries. They would link with a lot of the universities rather than doing their own training, and they become then a linked provider, if you like. But it's like a partnership, so they don't have to engage with QQI and go through all the quality assurance machine, because the university is doing it on their behalf. And they come under then the fee paid by the university for the quality assurance of the program. So it's much more efficient for big companies to link with a university or another large provider rather than doing it themselves. So that's one way they have found. And sometimes they tender among the universities for that provision, who will give them the best deal to do the training for them. So I think it's a much more practical and realistic way of doing it than going through all the cost that the community and voluntary bodies are being forced to do.